Okay, we've discussed some of the critical issues leading up to the real heavy conflict of the Civil War, which will really be starting in 1861, particularly in July of 1861. But as we know, the South at the outset of this war took a defensive posture. They're going to kind of hold back and force the North to attack them. This gives them and their weaker manpower a strategic sort of position from which they're fighting on the defensive. It always takes more troops and more manpower to mount an offensive sort of position in a war. And so there are a lot of people in the South that are saying what we ought to do is just go up north and slam them because we can get this early decisive victory. That's going to lead to more foreign powers, places like England and Spain and France, supporting us in our war effort. But the military leadership there knows that this is probably not the most practical solution if warfare becomes a little bit more prolonged and dragged out. In the North, people are calling for the same thing. They are demanding this secession thing has gone on for months now. We need to just put this war to an end. And the North thinks that they can do that. But a Northern general by the name of Winfield Scott is going to come up with a plan that I've already talked about, the Anaconda Plan. The goal is to completely surround the South, blockade them, and then crush on them from the outside in, forcing them to ultimately surrender. Both sides want this early decisive victory in the war. Both the commanders and leadership on both sides are kind of going, that's not the best tactic to take right now. The first major battle that we'll be talking about in the Civil War is the First Battle of Bull Run, which occurs in July of 1861 in Manassas, Virginia. What happens here is that 30,000 Union troops are going to march down to try to take a key railway junction that's in Manassas, Virginia. And what they're hoping to do is take this railway junction to cut off supplies coming into the Confederate capital. The troops that march down are collectively known as the Army of the Potomac. Now, they march south from D.C. They're going to go and attack and try to hold this railroad junction in Manassas, Virginia. And the battle does not go the North's way. It initially looks like it's going to, but when another offensive gets there from the South, when the Confederacy launches a heavier attack, the Northern troops start to show their inexperience. They break rank and they start retreating. They make this really haphazard, sort of hasty retreat, and they all start running back towards Washington, D.C. The Northern soldiers are here. They're just showing that inexperience, that inability to really hold themselves on the battlefield. The South is going to be emboldened by this victory. They're feeling very confident after this battle at Manassas, Virginia, the First Battle of Bull Run. And the Union defeat starts to make it painfully clear to the Union that this isn't going to be the quick, easy, decisive war we thought it was. The South is really ready for a fight. They're really ready to take us on in this war. And so they have to kind of fall back and regroup and start thinking about what are we really engaging in here? What is this war really going to look like? And within a week of that defeat at Manassas, the First Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln will change his tune quite a bit. Initially, he says, I need 75,000 guys, and I need them for 90 days. All of a sudden, he's going, I need 1 million soldiers, and I need them for 3 years. So you can see that the North has changed its attitude towards this war. This is not going to be a quick, easy, crush them and it's done kind of war. This is going to be a long, protracted series of battles that will really test the patience of the Northern leadership and of people in Northern society. At this point, Lincoln is going to turn to a general by the name of George McClellan to help rebuild the Army of the Potomac. This is a big problem, and it's going to become a major theme throughout the early years of the war, up until 1863, 1864. McClellan and Lincoln hate one another. They absolutely cannot stand one another. McClellan's attitude is that Lincoln is a president. He needs to keep his nose out of military business. His job is that of a politician, not of a military commander. And so whenever Lincoln gives him an order, McClellan is going to go, I don't need your orders, don't tell me what to do. Whereas Lincoln sees himself as the commander-in-chief of the Union Army and feels that when he gives an order to his generals, those orders should be followed. Now, there's a problem here. McClellan and Lincoln hate each other, But McClellan's men, the soldiers who serve underneath him, love him. And so it's not going to be so easy to get rid of McClellan once he is in command of the Army of the Potomac. And he very quickly is able to whip them back into shape and rebuild that into a 150,000 man strong army. While that's going on over in Virginia, which is really the epicenter of warfare, is going to be northern Virginia, that sort of boundary line between Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Maryland. There is another arena of warfare going on that they call the Western Frontier. So, with the Union's defeat at Bull Run, they are going to really need to manage some early victories out west. So the armies out there are under the command of, at this point, a virtual unknown to the sort of overall power structure of the Union Army. It's a guy by the name of Ulysses S. Grant. So Grant, for his part, is not well liked within the military. He's been actually censured and sort of disciplined for previous problems that he had with drinking. The guy's a bit of an alcoholic. But he is a very astute military commander. And in February of 1862, Grant gets some decisive victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. And this is going to drive the Confederate forces from Kentucky and Tennessee entirely. So he keeps pushing them back. He's forcing them out of the upper South. And he's driving them back towards the deep South. And the whole plan here is, again, part of that larger scheme of the Anaconda Plan. The Union wants to take control of the Mississippi River, so they need to push the Confederate forces out of there so that they control the upper Mississippi. Now, while he and his men are camped at a place called Shiloh Church, Tennessee, the Confederate armies spring a surprise attack on Grant and his men, and they almost wipe his forces out. This almost ends the push and the march that the Union armies are making on the Western frontier. But Grant, again, being a very good military leader, he's able to hold his men together, withstand the siege at Shiloh Church, and he waits for reinforcements to arrive. When they do, he's able to beat back the Confederates there, and then it starts to become a very clear march southward. By June of 1862, Grant has pushed the Confederates in the Mississippi River all the way down south to Vicksburg, Mississippi. So he is very successful at creating this western boundary from which they can start to choke out the Confederacy. This does a few other things as well. Some of the western Confederate states are going to be made largely obsolete. Places like Texas are not going to be able to help the war effort as much if the heart of the Confederacy is blocked at the Mississippi River. And so Grant keeps pushing down from the north and pushing down the Mississippi River Valley. And at the same time, the Union Navy is under the command of a guy named General David Farragut. They are going to launch a decisive attack on New Orleans, and they're going to win in that Battle of New Orleans there. And so what that does is it wipes the Confederacy out in the Mississippi River Valley. Grant pushes down from the north. Farragut comes up from New Orleans in the south, and they meet together, and they've now split the Confederacy in two. And they've created that western boundary from which they can start to choke out the heart of the Confederacy. As much as we have some issues going on in Virginia for the Union, the battles out on the western frontier underneath Ulysses S. Grant are very, very successful in the early years of the war. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of the early campaigns, what's happening from 1861 to 1863, is what's known as the Peninsular Campaign. This is going to really highlight that animosity between General McClellan and Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln is ultimately very pleased with what's happening out west, with Grant's progress out there. And he thinks, right now is the time to strike. The iron's hot. We've got the Confederacy scrambling out west. Let's launch another attack towards their capital in Richmond, Virginia. And so he wants to take on the armies of Northern Virginia, who are really going to be the sort of heart of the Confederate power. And he turns again to McClellan in order to do this. He says, McClellan, we've got to attack. But McClellan, again, just not liking the fact that he has to take orders from a non-military figure like Lincoln, he says, no. My men aren't ready, and he stalls. He holds the men up and he waits. And the problem is that ultimately this is going to really create, again, this tension between Lincoln and McClellan, but it also is going to give the South a chance to reinforce Richmond. And so he says, nah, my men aren't ready. And Lincoln says, I don't care. I gave you an order, attack, and attack right now. So if you look at a map, to march out of Washington, D.C. into Richmond, Virginia, it's a straight shot. You're on a straight southerly march. You'll be there in no time. McClellan doesn't do this. Instead, he comes up with this overly elaborate idea of the Peninsular Campaign. Instead of just marching his troops south, he loads all of the Union Army and their supplies up onto boats, and he sails them a short distance out of the Chesapeake Bay and wraps them right back around and lands them on a peninsula in Virginia. And so now he has to deal with 400 ships, 130,000 Union troops. It's this huge logistical nightmare, to be honest, and he doesn't need to do it. There's no reason for it. But what he's doing is he's buying time, and he's deliberately sort of going around Lincoln's orders here. And so once they've landed, McClellan and his troops hold up on this peninsula in Virginia, and they still are stalling on this attack. This gives the Confederates the chance to bring 17,000 troops in to defend Richmond. Now, because of this, Lincoln is forced to withhold 30,000 more soldiers that he could have sent down directly at Richmond to help try to crush the capital of the Confederacy. He has to hold them back to protect Washington, D.C., because now the Confederate troops are stronger in northern Virginia. So, when McClellan finally launches his attack, and he goes after the city of Richmond, it's too late. It's too well defended. He's going to go over there and fight, but nobody wins. They're basically going to fight to a stalemate. So what this shows is that McClellan has now squandered this opportunity to go ahead and really strike a blow at the heart of the Confederacy, to basically take their capital away from them. And it's all because he is constantly having this sort of spitting match, to use friendlier terms than we're all used to, with Abraham Lincoln. Now, ultimately, during this campaign, Robert E. Lee, the very famous commander that we're all familiar with today, will be put in command of the armies of Northern Virginia. And so he is going to lead them on to some very, very key victories immediately after that. He's going to be able to win the Second Battle of Bull Run, where they'll engage again at Manassas, Virginia with Northern troops. He's going to win the Battle of Fair Oaks and the 7 Days Battle. These are all critical battles that are being won, that really the South shouldn't be winning all these battles. They shouldn't be gaining this momentum. They're outgunned. They're outmanned. But because he's a great military leader and McClellan's constantly fighting with Lincoln, the North is squandering these opportunities to bring a decisive end to this war in its early years. Now, McClellan is still going to be forced to retreat to the Virginia-D.C. border. And despite the fact that he has really blown this opportunity to take Richmond, he is going to basically still be in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln knows he can't get rid of McClellan because McClellan's troops love him too much. So while this is all going on, Lincoln starts talking about this idea of emancipation. He starts considering this idea. He has always been talking about how the war has been there to maintain the Union, but he is also playing with this idea of emancipating the slaves in the South. And he knows that if he does this while the Union is losing battles, it's going to look like a desperate measure, and it's going to be a blow to people's confidence in the Union's ability to win this war. But in mid-September of 1862, the Battle of Antietam will take place in Sharpsburg, Maryland. And Lincoln's thinking, this is it. When we win at Antietam, this is when I'll be able to announce emancipation. But McClellan, again, is going to be indecisive, and he's going to squander another chance at a clear victory, and they're going to fight to a stalemate there at Antietam as well. Now, ultimately, Lee's forces basically had to fall back to Virginia after Antietam. A common recurring theme throughout this war is that the South is going to make small and sporadic attacks into Northern territory, but for the most part, they do not have the manpower to create a sustained offensive in the North. So Lee is going to march his troops back to Virginia to regroup and resupply. And then Lincoln is finally going to have to acknowledge that McClellan is not the man for the job. And he's going to fire him, remove him from command of the Army of the Potomac. So the Battle of Antietam was the single deadliest day in the Civil War in the United States. Over 6,000 people would die and 17,000 troops would be wounded at Antietam. More casualties on the northern side than the southern side. And this is going to be a massive PR nightmare for Abraham Lincoln. Instead of being able to have this huge victory after which he can announce emancipation, he now is having to explain why they have yet again lost what should have been a clear victory. Shortly after Antietam in 1862, Lincoln is going to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He realizes he can't wait anymore. This is something that needs to be done. It's important to understand what this is. There's a lot of misconceptions surrounding the Emancipation Proclamation. It does not free slaves in the United States of America. It is not a law. It is a war document. What this war document does is it frees any slaves who are living in Confederate territory. So what that means is that Lincoln is making an order, and he's saying, if you're a slave living in the Confederacy, you're free. You're free to walk off the plantation and leave. But there's a problem with this. Here's the issue. Lincoln is no longer in charge of the Confederate States. Lincoln is not the president of the Confederate States. He's the president of the United States. And so ultimately what's going on here is that Lincoln is issuing this order, but it's of limited efficacy. And another important thing to point out is that slaves are not waiting for Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Slaves are not sitting there going, I hope he issues an order soon and then we'll walk off the plantation. As soon as the Union Army moves into any area of the South, the slaves emancipate themselves. Again, it's important to see them not as non-actors, but as active participants in their own lives. They're not going to sit around and wait for a piece of paper to free them. They are leaving the plantation. Over 1 million slaves had left the plantations in the South before this order had ever been issued. But another thing to point out is that Emancipation Proclamation does not free slaves in the United States. If you're a slave in Maryland and the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, you're still a slave in Maryland. You're still a slave in Delaware. You're still a slave in Missouri, and you're still a slave in Kentucky. And so it has no bearing on the legality of slavery in the United States. It is simply a war measure meant to undercut the economic backbone of the Confederacy, which is slavery. It's intended to get more slaves, to embolden slaves to get up and leave the plantation, something they'd already been doing. So, in a wider sense, this is going to have an impact on the Northern outlook on the war. What's going to happen here is that this war is no longer about secession and maintenance of the Union. That rhetoric will always be there. It's there throughout the war. But it shifts the way that the North is thinking about this war. More and more people in the North start to see this war as being about slavery, truly about the core issue at hand, and that is slavery. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this mini lecture video is Northern Democrats. These are sort of a rarity during the war, but it is important to understand that the North it still has pockets of Democratic politicians operating therein. So really, the North is associating the Democratic Party with slavery, with the Confederacy, with secession. But there are still, like I said, small areas of the North where Democrats enjoy some political support. Most of the Democrats in the North approve of the war effort. They support Lincoln. They support the Union. One of those is going to be Lincoln's vice president, a guy by the name of Andrew Johnson, was somebody we're going to be talking about a little bit in Reconstruction. But there are other Democrats in the North that are referred to historically as Copperheads. In their own time, they call themselves Peace Democrats. These are Democrats that are arguing for an immediate ceasefire in the war. for a return to diplomacy, that the North and South should start working together to find a diplomatic solution and a non-military solution to these problems. And they're saying that the North should basically just say, hey, look, ultimately, if you want to have slaves, then we should allow you to have slaves. And so they call themselves Peace Democrats, but they're named after the poisonous snake. That's how a lot of Northerners see these Democrats. They're seen as being snakes in the grass, people in our midst that'll strike out and attack us, that'll attack at the heart of what this war is really all about. And so they say, the Copperheads are even saying, if this results in an independent confederacy where slavery is legal, then so be it. The war just needs to come to an end. So Lincoln is going to ultimately start looking at these individuals as treasonous or seditious. And he actually starts throwing them in jail and locking them up without trials for the remainder of the war. A big example of this is a guy by the name of Clement Vallandigham. He's an Ohio congressman, and he's a very outspoken Peace Democrat or Copperhead. He's going to be arrested in May of 1863, immediately after making a speech in which he says, if the South wants to be independent, let them be independent. But again, this creates a problem for Lincoln. He's locking up people for saying things that he doesn't like. This is a violation of their inalienable rights, of their constitutional rights. And again, this provides more fodder to the South who's saying, that's Lincoln, that's King Lincoln. When King Lincoln doesn't like something, King Lincoln changes the rules. He changes the laws. He doesn't care about people's rights, and he doesn't care about the Constitution. He cares about African Americans, and he wants to enslave whites. That's really what Lincoln's all about. And so again, that is continuing to push this rhetoric forward in the South. Lincoln is taking these actions because he feels that it is necessary to maintain the war effort, but it is going to consistently be used against him, and it will reinforce that vision of who Lincoln really is in the American South. So that's where I'm going to wrap up this particular lecture. When in the next mini lecture, we're going to be talking about conscription and the draft riots and moving on to some of the campaigns in the later war.